We are welcoming today Reverend Dr. Tod Bolsinger. You may know him best through his books that he has most recently written, Canoeing the Mountains and Tempered Resilience. At least that's how I came to know you, Tod, so others may have as well. But he also has lots of other things that he's involved with. He is the executive director of the Dupree Center Church Leadership Institute, a senior fellow of the Dupree Center for Leadership, and the associate professor of leadership formation at Fuller Theological Seminary. There's lots of things that he was involved in prior to that, and he's also co-owner and principal of A.E. Sloan Leadership, Inc., an executive coaching and consulting firm. So he's coming to us from pleasant Pasadena, California. So he's a little behind us time-wise. He's still working on the morning, but we're glad you're here, Tod, and I will, without further ado, turn it over to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's nice to be with all of you. We're going to spend a couple of hours together today, which will be helpful, I think, as a standalone, but it also relates to what I'll be sharing tomorrow with the larger presbytery. You get to do a bit of a deeper dive. I've entitled it How Not to Waste a Crisis. And so we're going to talk about the way in which times of disruption actually challenge us to different leadership models that give us the opportunity to move from surviving to thriving. What I tend to do in these 2-hour seminars is break it up a little bit. Nobody likes to listen to someone just talk on Zoom for 2 hours. So we'll spend a little bit of time. I'll spend about 30 to 35 minutes with some content. And then I've asked Cheryl just to break us up into some quick, small groups where you can process a little bit. The thing I really do believe is the more tangible and more concrete that you can make your reflection, the better it will be. One of the things we know about adult learners is we tend to learn better from the concrete to the abstract than from the abstract to the concrete. I always say that it's way better to taste a meal before you try to cook the recipe. And so it's better to spend more time in the more concrete you can make it. So we'll do about 15 minutes in some small groups, and then we'll come back and then we'll debrief that first with about 10 minutes of just some Q&A and debrief with me, and then we'll do it again for a second hour. So there'll be a rhythm to it. So if you find yourself a person who's tired of listening to people on Zoom, this is going to be a long couple of hours. Hopefully the combination of modalities will help. So I'm going to dive in just right from the beginning and share my screen. I do want you to know that all the slides that I have today, I'll give you an opportunity to get these slides and kind of what I call the greatest hits. It'll also include some for tomorrow. We basically have done a lot of webinars and a lot of speaking in the last couple of years and know the slides that are most requested. And so we've got a whole slide deck already prepared. You can just click on a QR code and get a slide deck from us that'll tell you about some of the stuff we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to jump in from here. So as I said, I call this How Not to Waste a Crisis. And really, it's just an opportunity to think about this in a couple of ways. So first of all, I've spent the better part of the last 15 years going around the country using this definition of leadership from Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky. Leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. And the reason why I start with this is that what most of us have discovered it writ large during the last couple of years with COVID and everything, is that the hard part of leadership is that you've got to take people where they resist going. They may say they want to go there. You know, we want to reach our neighbors. We want to get younger. We want to have more vibrancy. We want to be more diverse. We want to be more inclusive. Like, we say a lot of stuff, but it's once you start making the changes necessary, we end up disappointing people. And that's really the hard part. And I always say that for most of us as pastors, I mean, this was written for business people, right? The hard line that they heard was leadership is disappointing. For pastors, the hard phrase in the middle of this is your own people, right? The hard part about leadership is the disappointment of our own people that is necessary to move our people, the very people who called us and asked us to lead them to the place where they need to go. And that's really at the center of the struggle of leadership. And I always say everybody who got into leadership, especially in the church, we got into this because we love God, we love people, We want to introduce the people we love to the God we love. We want to do that by building a church they will love. What's not to love? But when we start realizing is when we start building the church that they will love, especially those whom we love, who our hearts break for the people who may be on the margins, may be excluded, may have walked away from the church, the kinds of people who we find are kind of our shepherd heart, the one that wandered off. When we start building a church for those folks, we've got to dismantle and reframe a church for people who have loved it just the way it is. Thank you very much, even if it's not working very much. And that's been the struggle for most of us. So for me, when I start talking about leadership, I'm always talking about it within kind of the intersection of two spaces. It's the space of organizational leadership, accomplishing a mission, and of spiritual formation, which for me, that's kind of like my home turf. I got a PhD in spiritual formation. I was a pastor of spiritual formation before I became a senior pastor. I was trained for 10 years at Hollywood Presbyterian Church. I worked with college students, and then I was the pastor of discipleship and spiritual formation, and then was asked to become the pastor of a congregation in San Clemente, where I was there for 17 years. And the center of my experience of being a pastor is this notion of how the Christian community can be a spiritually transformative place. So for me, leadership is energizing a community of people toward their own transformation, but not just for their transformation. It's in order to accomplish a shared mission. That when we have a sense that this is why we're here, why God has us here, what the reason our church exists, the reason our congregation is called to be a witnessing community in this area, that when we become aware that in a changing environment, that is going to require us to go through ongoing transformation. So it's in that context that we find ourselves. And what's powerful for me about this, and one of the reasons why I'm thrilled to be with all of you today, is that I think this is one of the most deeply shared experiences at the moment in the church. I'm a Presbyterian, so it's nice to speak to my home tribe. But I spend a lot of my time with folks across the spectrum. I mean, this morning I had a conversation with a UCC pastor. Later today, I will have a conversation with an evangelical free pastor. I have worked with Lutheran Church Missouri Synods and Evangelical Lutheran Church. I worked with 3 different types of Presbyterians. I've worked with 3 different types of Presbyterians all in Orlando. I've worked with now soon to be 2 different types of Methodists, unfortunately, 3 different types of Baptists. I work Episcopalians, Anglicans. I've worked with Roman Catholic missionaries who are doing church planting with marginalized folks in Appalachia. And I work with the African Methodist Episcopal Conference in the eastern part of the United States. I've worked with the Salvation Army and the Vineyard. It's just across the board. And one of the things I've recognized is, I talk to people who do not talk to each other, but what we all have in common is this dramatically changing world that is requiring us to rethink the way in which we lead. So one of the things that's been really helpful for me has been an essay from Ronald Heifetz. That's who I referenced in that very first quote. And his colleagues, when they wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review called Leadership in a Permanent Crisis. Here's the premise. It was 2009 when they wrote the article, and they said, my gosh, we are 2009. We are less than 1 decade into the 21st century. And in 1 decade, we've already had 2 major crises. Can you imagine living in a world where you have 2 major crises every decade, right? We had 9/11. We had 2008 economic crisis. Oh my gosh, this is a different kind of world we're in. They had no idea 2020 was coming, did they? This world in which literally somebody put it to me this way, we have been, 1918, 1929, and 1968 all at the same time. We've had a health crisis that's led to an economic crisis, that's led to a political crisis that has been fueled by racial and social injustice. And now on top of it, with the most recent things happening in Eastern Europe, it's like we're in 1939 also. So it means that all of us sitting here leading congregations are leading in a time that maybe is unlike any other time in human history. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think it's the hardest time. I frankly don't think it's as painful or difficult to pastor today where we are as it would be in Ukraine. And all of us know there are these moments of deep crisis that we find ourselves in, like Uvalde, Texas, or like my former youth director, who is the associate pastor at Geneva Presbyterian in Laguna Woods and was on site during the shooting last week. But most of us have never been prepared for the complexity of this time. And the complexity of this time, as opposed to the intensity of this time, is really unique. So it takes a different way of thinking about crises. What Ronald Heifetz and his colleagues said is the way to think about a crisis in a way that you can move from surviving to thriving, surviving in the crisis to thriving after the crisis, is by breaking the crisis into two phases. And in one sense, this will become really intuitive for most of us. The first phase is the acute phase. The acute phase is an awful lot like being rushed to the emergency room. You are in an emergency. You are in a crisis. It is really acute. So you stabilize, you protect, you buy time. It's what Andy Crouch referred to in his article that was very popular at the beginning of the pandemic, a blizzard mentality. How do we hunker down and get through this? And that's exactly what you do in the first phase. You stabilize, protect, buy time. It's like you're rushed to the emergency room. Everybody takes it seriously as an emergency. And if you survive, which, if you've ever been in the emergency room, we're all sitting here today, so it probably worked. Here we are. You realize there came this moment when all of a sudden everybody realized we were out of the acute phase. We made it. We survived. And everybody took a deep breath. And if you're the patient, what happens at that moment is you start thinking, okay, how do I get back my pants? How do I get out of this little skirt thing they have me in? How do I get my clothes on and get my personal effects back? And how do I get home? How do I get to go back home? Because just remember this, the root word for family and familiar is the same root word, which means that when you're in an unfamiliar place, you don't just feel disoriented, you feel unfamilied. You feel alienated, abandoned, isolated. You're like a little kid who goes to Disney World and it's going to be the happiest day of their life. And if they lose mom and dad in Main Street, doesn't matter where Mickey is or Space Mountain or anything else, they got to run home to mama. And where many of us find ourselves is dealing with a congregation that every single time we go into a crisis, they want to run home back to what's familiar. What Heifetz and his colleagues said was, really good leaders understand there's a second phase to the crisis. And that second phase is what he called the adaptive phase. The adaptive phase is where you use the crisis to address the underlying issues that have been there all along, but we've not had the will to confront before the crisis. It's like all of a sudden we become really aware that these things have been here. They've been revealed through the crisis. But these are a much larger issues. It's what Andy Crouch called an ice age mentality. If you find yourself in this storm and you realize it's not just a freak storm, but is a change in environment, it's a change in climate. We're now in a whole nother world. Okay, what are we going to do to prepare for that? Heifetz and his colleagues say adaptive leadership seizes the opportunity of moments like this to hit the organizational reset button. So let's have you do a little thinking along with me. I want you to think about COVID. And obviously there's some probably great stories we could share about ways in which our congregations were remarkable. And if we had a little more time, we would probably do that. And I'd encourage you to spend some time doing that. But I want you to think of it the other way for the moment. What I want you to think about is, what were the underlying conditions that became very apparent during COVID that were actually revealing things that were there all along? Like, what are the things, like, what are those underlying conditions? So as you're thinking about it, here's an analogy. My dad is going to be 80 in August. And my dad had a number of the underlying health conditions that made COVID really dangerous. He has neuropathy and diabetes and heart problems. Indeed, my dad had to have a heart valve replacement during COVID, right? That heart was going bad for a while, but because we were in COVID, I mean, it was more apparent. My stepmom could see it. My sister and brothers who lived close to him could see and pay attention to it and recognize it. Probably saved his life because he was in COVID, because they could recognize something that if he had just been doing about his ordinary day, he probably would have fallen over. So what are some of those underlying conditions? Here's what I want you to do. I'd like you to chat them in. Let's just gather them all in one spot. So just what underlying conditions, what were present in your church ahead of time, but became really apparent? Things that if we had to hit the organizational reset button, we'd want to address. What are some of these larger things? Just go ahead and put them into chat and we'll just gather them up together if you have the chat function, because then we can all see kind of everybody's experience and we can share them all at once. So just give you a minute here to put those in the chat. Need for tech improvements. Yeah, obviously, right? All of a sudden, like, well, our technology may not be up for this day. It probably wasn't ahead of time, right? I always say the time, almost everybody who has a sound system, you try to go to the building committee and you say, hey, I think our sound system is going to go out one day. Well, when it goes out, that's when we use it, right? Tech stagnation. Okay. How to pastor without contact, right? Here, that's an interesting thing to think about, right, Jim? So good. What underlying issues did you see in your congregation? Challenges, things that you were facing. Communicating inside and outside the church. Yeah, the communication challenges. The biggest need for updating the website. Okay, great. Anything else? What were some of the things that you noticed? What did you notice about your congregation? Being a church without a building, right? All of a sudden we start realizing how dependent we are on our buildings. We say all the time, the church is not the building, it's the people. But what happens when you take away the building? You lose the people, right? Church struggling to define its mission. Okay, good. Look at that, Sandy. These deeper issues, culture of comfort. Yep. The notion of worship on demand. Yeah, like just people have a different way. Communication and connections in the congregation. Fear of socializing and being close. Okay, great. Church staff needs change. Yeah. Notice some of these things become really apparent and there's stuff we can fix quickly. I was stunned at how people pivoted. I literally March 13, 2020, Friday the 13th. I remember that's when my school grounded us, like no travel, no, we're going home. We're going to teach online. By that Sunday, every church I knew had a television ministry. They just called it Facebook Live. Like we all figured it out, but at least temporarily. Because there were deeper issues, like look at Jim talks about how to help people deal with their fears, right? Transitions continued up at the same time rate, but filling positions, interims as well as called pastors becomes much more difficult with a longer time frame. Right. Notice. Well, let me say, so here's an interesting thing. I told you about March 13, my world disrupted. So I have been for the better part of, since the book Canoeing the Mountains came out in 2015, I've been traveling about 100,000 miles a year. About 30 times I will get on a plane and go speak to some group. March 13, boom, shut down. 15 speaking engagements canceled. I just thought, well, I guess I won't be doing any talking about change. I had 170 webinars like this since then. And so what I often do is I'll ask people to chat in that question that I just gave you, which means that I get a chance to kind of collect the answers. And here are some of the most common answers. You might see some of yours reflected in the way this is, but you might also see some different ones. This is the most common ones across the board. The first thing most people noticed, a lot of people noticed, was a lack of deep, pervasive discipleship. When we took a look at our church at a deeper level, we went, wait a second. We talk about some of the most basic things in the gospel, like love God and love our neighbor. And our people were not as concerned about love and neighbor as we thought they were. We were not as Christian as we thought we were. During the first 400 years of the church's history, pandemics meant the church grew. People came to church people. They came to Christians because Christians acted different than the rest of the world. Oh my gosh, we've declined faster during the pandemic. So maybe we're not as discipled or as formed as we'd like us to be. A lack of community. I mean, we have people all the time saying, we're members of the body of Christ. We're members of each other. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. And then all of a sudden, the simplest thing seemed to divide us. And especially in churches where there's kind of philosophical or political divisions, we started realizing that, many churches started dividing over which newscast they listened to, that just people who were, deep to baptismal vows to raise children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord were now splitting or leaving or changing churches based on whether or not you had to wear a mask. Lack of cross-generational engagement. None of you mentioned this, but maybe it's not so true in your area, but in many churches, there's this profound awareness that that we are losing the younger generation. We've been losing that younger generation for 10 years, and now it's accelerating. Almost every marker that is true in the church is accelerated in younger. So about 40% of clergy in 2021 said that they were considering leaving. That number was up to 50% for clergy under 45. The lack of extensive leadership capacity. I mean, there are certain places in the country that all during COVID, you could keep gathering as long as you gathered in groups of under 12 and could be socially distant. And if you're in a good location, and I remember somebody said to me, yeah, but what can you possibly do for Christianity with just 12 people? I kept thinking, what could you possibly do for 12 people? Right? The problem isn't the 12 people. The problem is, do we have enough leaders to break our church up into 12 people? It's, the old 80-20 principle, right? 20% of the people do 80% of the work. Every pastor I know would take that deal. If I could get 20% of the people to do 80% of the work, that would be a good thing, because our church is built on the back of like 4 people who just overwork all the time. A lack of prophetic wisdom. Our scriptures are filled with texts about justice. And yet we've had a hard time being able to bring scriptural wisdom to bear in a way that just feels like it's consistent with who we are. Now, maybe these are different than you would have in your particular location. Everybody's got different ones. But the most important thing to recognize is that what the pandemic and the crisis reveals are these deeper underlying issues. These aren't things that can be fixed with getting a new camera or trying to find a new MailChimp program. These are like deeper issues, like not just communication, but community, not just trying to get our worship services out, but get our people formed. Not just trying to figure out who will cover all of the responsibilities, but how do we actually develop leadership that will actually help our mission to go forward? These profoundly deep things that have been in the middle of it. When you think of these things, it's really tempting to feel just overwhelmed by it. Almost every pastor I know is exhausted. Like I'm grateful for the number of pastors I know who got sabbaticals, and I give thanks literally for like the Lilly Endowment that has just funded a lot of sabbaticals. But part of the reason why is because of not just we need more rest, but the way in which we work. So Ed Friedman is a name many of you probably know, Jewish rabbi who's written on how family systems theory applies to congregational life. He has this great quote. This is probably the most provocative and the most popular quote that I share in my workshops and seminars. He puts it this way. He says, "When any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked, any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked. It cannot get free simply through more thinking about the problem. Conceptually stuck systems cannot be unstuck simply by trying harder." If you don't hear anything else from today, could you please hear this? We're not going to outwork this problem. These are big issues. We're not going to outwork them. It's like trying to paddle harder in a canoe when there isn't any water. You're just going to get exhausted. When conceptually stuck systems cannot be unstuck simply by trying harder, it requires a fundamental reorientation. For a fundamental reorientation to occur, that spirit of adventure, which optimizes serendipity and which enables new perceptions beyond the control of our thinking processes, must happen first. What do we mean by serendipity and new perceptions? Well, this is at the heart of what he means by a spirit of adventure. A spirit of adventure requires learning, and it results in facing loss. What it requires is us to lead differently. In a place where we don't know what's going on, we have to lead in a totally different way. We're going to have to lead where we don't have answers. So it's going to require learning. And we're going to have to lead in a way where we're going to have to let go of that, which got us this far, which means it results in loss. Now, if you're at all familiar with my book, Canoeing the Mountains, you know that I use the metaphor of Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. After 18 months of going from St. Charles, Missouri, up the Missouri River, they found themselves on August 12th, 1805, at the border of what is Montana and Idaho. Now, remember, the Corps of Discovery was participating in a 300-year-old project, a project that started in Europe that was all about the economics of Europe. And the United States jumped in on that project. And the project is this: if you could control the water route, you could control the trade route of getting raw material from places like Asia and Africa to Europe. Getting raw material from those places to Europe, where the market was, if you could control that trade route, then you could tax everybody, and that would make you a wealthy, powerful nation. And for the fledgling United States of America, they wanted in on this deal. They wanted to try to figure out, how can we control the trade route that would connect Europe and Africa together over water, because it's easier to move raw material over water than over land. So the intention was basically this. It is come from the Atlantic Ocean, go around the Gulf of Mexico, go up the Mississippi River, go across the Missouri River, connect to the Columbia River, and that will take you to the Pacific Ocean. Boats had come up the Columbia River. Boats had gone a long way up the Missouri River. No one had found where it connected. Whoever found that would be finding what they called the Northwest Passage. And so for 18 months, they paddled upstream, up the Missouri River. And on August 12th, 1805, they found themselves at this little incline. They expected that they would take their boats out of one river, carry them a half a day, put them into another river, and after 18 months of going upstream, they'd now get to go downstream. And going downstream, they would pick up momentum, it would get easier, they would race to Pacific Ocean, they would take a selfie, send it back to Thomas Jefferson. They would claim themselves as the explorers that discovered the Northwest Passage. And then they would go home. And of course, as you know, they looked up over the Lemhi Pass and saw the Rocky Mountains. Now, you live in Florida, and I know a big mountain is Space Mountain. But let me say something about mountains. If you spend any time in the Appalachians, you know that it looks a lot like these green hills that are at the beginning of the picture. And in their mind, when they thought mountains, this is what they believed they would have. They spent the winter with the Mandan tribe in North Dakota. They asked the Mandan, is there a river on the other side? And the Mandan said, yes, there is. And you just have to cross over mountains. And they thought mountain schmountains were from Virginia, because what they thought a mountain was these green hills in front. They had never seen mountains like those in the distance. Mountains that would, in the Rocky Mountains, jut up to 14,000 feet. That would have 300 miles of mountains that are above the tree line. They would have 60 miles of mountains that would be in hip deep snow, and that a river could not run through. How do you canoe over mountains? You don't. Now, one of my favorite stories about this, of course, is that they had seen the Rocky Mountains for 3 months. I mean, if you've ever traveled to Western Kansas on a clear day, you can see the Rocky Mountains in the distance. But they wrote in their journals, Meriwether Lewis wrote in his journal, I refuse to believe this will be anything but a safe and comfortable passage. Because denial runs really deep. We want to believe that everything in front of us is going to be the same as it was behind us. That because we were an expert in the past, we'll be fine in the future. because we came on a trip that was meant to be a water trip, and we built boats. They invented a boat for this trip that they would be fine, that they could just paddle their way forward. But what do you do if the world in front of you is nothing like the world behind you? When it's been completely disrupted, when you can no longer paddle your way forward, when we're no longer even on a river trip, what do you decide to do? This is exactly the dynamic that the church finds itself in today. We are standing on the Lemhi Pass. The world has been disrupted. We are looking into a future that looks nothing like the world behind us. And we're trying to ask ourselves, what do we do? Some of us are saying, what matters is we came to discover, but what we really are about is about canoeing. What we need to do is go back, and we need to protect canoeing. We need to make sure that everybody's committed to canoeing, that we pass on the great history of canoeing, that we make sure that we protect people who make canoes, that it's not about going forward, it's really about canoeing. Others of us are sitting on the Lemhi Pass, and we're just frozen. We know that our calling is not in the past, that the canoes might be something we actually have to drop. We just don't know how to go forward. Somebody said that the entire city of Denver, Colorado was founded by people who made their way across the Great Plains and went through all the hardships. And then one day just woke up and said, right here, we're going to stop right here. And a lot of us, especially those of us who've been at this for a while, think, what do I just need to do to hang on right here? Maybe I'll create an Airbnb with a view. The church will talk about the future. It just won't go. It'll make sure it'll inspire people at the potential of the future, but we'll just stay right here. But what would it mean to actually be like Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and the Corps of Discovery, who got to this point and they just wrote in their journal, we proceeded on. To be really clear, one of the men wrote in his journal, those are the most horrible mountains we ever beheld, because I'm sure he believed he had to carry his canoes over them. They were canoers. How do you move forward? One of my friends likes to tell a story about a priest, his priest friend who was a spiritual director, and his brother is a jet fighter pilot. And the jet fighter pilot let the priest spend some time in his flight simulator. And the priest comes out of the flight simulator having had this experience that's like simulated what it was like to fly jets. And he looked up at the guy training and said, why do you use flight simulators? And he wrote back, because at the moment of crisis, you will not rise to the occasion. You will default to your training. One of the things that happens in a crisis is we realize what we were trained for, and that we default back to old training all the time. That in moments of crisis, we go back and do what we've always done. We just do it harder. If we were on a river trip, we paddle harder. Doesn't matter that we're in a world that's run out of water. So no wonder we're exhausted. The answer isn't to keep trying harder. The answer is to train differently. And that training for this new terrain is what's at the core of this experience of trying to not waste a crisis. We don't waste a crisis when we allow it to invite us to train differently. If you're familiar with Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky's work, you know this is where they talk about the difference between what's called technical problems and adapt challenges. And let me say just a little bit about this, and then I'll have you do some responses and we'll come back to it. So, technical problems. A technical problem is not an easy problem. A technical problem is simply a problem an expert can solve. That's what it means. Experts solve it. They use best practices. So if you're having a heart bypass or a valve replacement like my father had, you want an expert who has best practices. If you're having a root canal, you want an expert who has best practices. If somebody's in the hospital, you want someone who's been trained in how to do hospital visitation. They're experts. There are best practices. We went through CPE, and so we learned, look, you don't walk into a hospital room and give a sermon. Like, there are certain things you do, right? You're an expert with best practices. I said, everybody who comes to seminary, somebody said to them, you're the best Christian I know. You should go pro. And they go off to professional Christian school, and we give them a Master of Divinity. And we teach them best practices, how to exegete scriptures, how to care for people, how to understand our theology and our polity. And you go home and that's what you do. I would say we teach people how to preach a sermon on the Trinity without committing heresy, like without having to talk about eggs or water or shamrocks. Like, you can do it. It's hard, but you can do it. Technical problems are problems that experts solve with best practices. Adaptive challenges cannot be solved by experts. They can't be solved by existing knowledge, skills, and tools. They require people to make a shift in values, expectations, attitudes, or habits of behavior. Shifting, a different perspective, seeing it differently, letting things go. And how do you learn to decide what you shift and what you don't shift? That's the challenge of an adaptive challenge. Adaptive challenges are faced by learners doing experiments as opposed to experts and best practices. So let me be clear. Next time I get on a plane, I don't want an adaptive pilot. I don't want anybody learning. I don't want there to be any experimenting, right? I want someone who can land the plane. But when we're dealing with some of the things we're facing today, where there are no best practices, I can give you best practices on how to do a really good Zoom service. There are very few best practices about how to help your congregation grow deeper in faith in its context with its challenges. You can't just take what they're doing at some big church down the street and bring it here. You're going to have to actually learn as you go. Adaptive challenges cannot be solved. They require learning, and they result in facing loss. So let me just say that one of the hardest things for most of us at this moment is we were not trained that leaders are learners. Learning is what you do when you start as a Christian. You're a disciple, you're a learner. But most of us, when we go into leadership, the understanding is now we're no longer the learner. Now we're the master of divinity. Think about that. It sounds like a superhero. And the three hardest words for a human to say, psychologists tell us, are not "I love you" or "I forgive you." It is "I don't know." You actually have to lead the learning. In times of great change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. Learning. To lead as a learner, to stand in front of your own people and say, "I don't know where the answer is, but we're going to discover it together." How does that change the way we lead at times like this? Adaptive challenges require learning. Sound familiar? They result in facing loss. And they have them other components too. They reveal competing values. When people start asking you stuff like, who does the church exist for? Every single time we want to say both and, the adaptive challenge will press us to decide. Are we for primarily our members, or are we for our mission to our neighbors? Which is going to be our first priority? If a win-win can't be found here, but instead might have to be 1-2 or 1A, 1B, or now this, then that, then how do the competing values get navigated? It's going to require experimentation, which means we're going to experience failure. We're going to have to learn through experimentation, through saying these things didn't work. And it's going to result in resistance that must be faced with resilience, because our own people will struggle with the changes that we're asked them. If you went on this canoe trip because you thought it was a water trip, and now we're telling you you're going to have to walk. And on top of that, we're telling you that the boats you helped bring, the boats you helped build, Lewis and Clark invented a boat that we're now going to drop, or we're going to burn as firewood. You're no longer an expert water navigator. You're just a dude who carries luggage, and your entire identity is changed at that moment. Those issues, those adaptive challenges are complicated. They have gaps between the things we say and the things we do. They reveal the stuff that is unspeakable, that we haven't spoken. No one's going to mention the fact that we're also really disappointed in the leaders. They said it would be a water route, and it's not. We find ourselves doing work avoidance. Well, we should attend to this. Of course, I know our church is dying, but what we really got to do is get a new roof. I know we need to reach our neighbors, but what we really got to do is figure out which denominational initials will be on the door. We find ourselves distracting and blaming, and then having to work forward in a totally different way. Okay, let me just have you do a couple of things. I'm going to stop here for now because I'm going to have you do a little bit of conversation, and we'll come back to this piece. What I want you to think about is the way in which this strikes you. What questions does this raise for you? What does this help you think about in terms of your own experience of canoeing the mountains? And here's the place that I want you to think about just kind of two thoughts about this whole notion, two principles about adaptive change. Principle number one is people don't resist change, they resist loss. People don't resist change, they resist loss. Let me just put that on the screen so you can see this. And the second is the future's here, it's just on the margins. There are already people in our midst who have experienced these changes. There are people in our midst who are not at the center, who don't have an investment in the past, and who might be able to energize us to the future. In the Lewis and Clark story, that is represented by Sacagawea, a teenage Native American nursing mother who wasn't lost when they went into uncharted territory. This was her territory. She led them to the Shoshone. The Shoshone helped them move forward. What they had to do was let go of their assumptions that they knew everything because they came from the President of the United States and needed to learn to listen to other people. So I want to give you a couple minutes to talk about this. Let me just have you think. As you listen to these very first principles, what I want you to think about is this. Flip ahead and we'll come back. What stands out positively to you so far and why? What have you heard so far that actually affirms what you know to be true, that encourages you? And what questions does this raise? And how might this have rubbed you wrong or create dissonance? How does this irk you? Welcome back. So you survived your little test where I intentionally let myself leave the room just to see what happens. You can thank the Southern California Edison for that one. Like my entire house just power went out, whoosh, all at one time. So Cheryl did a great job of keeping us on track. Well, so let me just ask a few of you who might be willing to just bring back from your conversation to the top of the room. Where was the particular energy? Where did you find yourself talking about? You might have started with one thing, but there was kind of energy in the conversation that allowed you to that you found yourself kind of either swirling about or getting excited about or working on together. Just as you thought about these things, where was the energy in your conversation? Let me just start with that. So any of you who'd feel free to unmute and raise those things. And it can even be critical energy, as far as I'm concerned. I'm an Enneagram 8. I'm pretty okay with conflict.
Well, we talked a lot about the adaptive change versus technical change, and continued to kind of circle back to that. Where do we hear about it first? And it, for some, it was in 2013. For me, it was beginning of the pandemic. So to realize, but how relevant a book written in 2009 has been for us in 2020, 21, 22.
Yeah. So when you found yourself talking about it, where does the concept, how does the concept help you think about the challenges you have, and where does it become complicated to think about it? Where does it help? Where maybe does it need some more unpacking?
I'll speak for myself. The having to continue this learning curve after being in ministry for 29 years, doing it certain ways, and then to figure out gosh, because I'm a pastor at heart. And when you couldn't go out and be with people, how did I do that? So, I spent lots of time on the telephone, making those kind of adaptive changes and learning how do you minister to folks when you can't see them. And so that was, and the technical changes, are things we know, but these adaptive changes that we've had to deal with, none of us have ever been through a pandemic before.
Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah. And part of what you start to recognize is the larger adaptive challenges that are not just, we're used to being face to face and we got to use a telephone, but it's like, what does it mean for us to be a church where everybody requires the pastor to know their name and to be present? And what does it mean for us to lead differently when we can't be present with people in that same way? Like if you keep asking yourself, what is the shift we need to make in habits or values or attitudes or expectations? What is the learning that we need to take on? And then the hardest part is, what is the loss? What are we gonna have to let go of? That's one of the hardest things. I've noticed that many people early in the pandemic said, wow, we shut down a bunch of programs that we just can't do. Maybe we'll get to get rid of them. And as soon as we started coming back, people are like, can we go do this thing again? Like you start gathering back all these things. Many of them didn't work. We realized to drop something might have actually felt freeing for a moment, but now to tell people we're going to permanently get rid of it, we're not going to use it, we're going to move forward, it can be pretty profoundly hard, even in terms of mental models and expectations. So others of you, where was energy in your conversation? Where did you find yourself talking about?
I'll say something, Todd. Just talking, using the word experiment a lot more frequently as you talk to the congregation. We're going to experiment with this, and people seem to take that well because it doesn't sound permanent if you use the word experiment, which is helpful to ease people into change. And the other thing is I have been surprised, I don't know why, but I've been surprised at really how much loss is involved. And which is the underlying emotion that is there that makes people resistant and not want to move in a direction. And it can feel and look like anger and frustration, but really what's behind it is this is not familiar to me. It means I'm giving something up, so it's loss.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like my church. What happened to my church? Yeah. So when you realize people don't resist change, they resist loss. This will become really important tomorrow when we talk about sabotage and resilience. When you talk about the fact that people are operating from a place of loss, this is both for us as ministers, this is both helpful. We are good at helping people with loss. One of the first things we're trained in how to do is, what do you do with people who are going to die? What we're not good is helping systems think about loss. And especially helping systems think about loss that we are choosing, like that we're actually walking in and choosing losses that are necessary, but that people will hang on to. So they're going to resist, and they're going to resist us for being those people. One of the parts that I work a lot with folks is that to use the language of experiment, to really use it well, you've got to get rid of the idea that you're going to talk about, we're going to ask ourselves if this will work. Instead, change it to, we're doing this experiment to figure out what we're going to learn. Experiments are about learning. So we're going to focus on learning. We're trying to develop the capacity for the congregation to learn. So when we say we're going to do an experiment, we're going to say, look, we're going to find out is we have these questions we want to ask. Like, for example, we want to ask how does our congregation, I always think ask a what question or a how question. How does our congregation best think about reaching our neighbors? So we're going to do an experiment on how many people know somebody in the neighborhood? Like, what are their names? Like, we're just going to try some, we call safe, modest experiments. When I was working with some folks in Silicon Valley, They said to me, there's a process. They always talk about fail fast, learn fast. One of the people said, I'm a venture capitalist. It's my money. Fail cheap, right? Fail cheap, fail fast, learn fast, do small experiments. Understand, since we don't know what's going to come out of it, we're going to experiment on the back end. We're going to find out what we know. So one of the churches that I work with, they did almost this conversation that we were having earlier about, like, okay, so I can't do pastoral care. So what we're going to do, we're going to call everybody. Okay, I worked with a church that has 4,000 members. They called everybody. They just realized we have enough people who can call people. Get everybody in your church who does real estate. Tell them that you need them to do 100 phone calls. That's easy. They're like, that's 10 calls a day in 10 days. I'll have that done by lunch, right? Like, we're going to call everybody. Why? Because we're just going to check in and say, how are you? How are you doing? What can we pray for? What do we need? All of a sudden we start finding there's all these needs. We also find that there's all this experience of people feeling more connected than ever. Okay, what do we learn by when people feel more connected than ever? We might find we have whole different kinds of things to have to deal with than we didn't think before. It's the reframing because of the learning. I'll give you one other example. It's from another. I love this example because it's from a big church that's a totally different tribe than ours. So I work with a church that is a relatively large church that's a Bible church in Texas, right? So at their peak, they had probably 4,000 members. And they built it, and they were on a trajectory for building bigger. They thought they were going to be even bigger. They thought they were heading toward like 10,000. Because if you've ever been to Texas, you know that 4,000 is a small church. They're just used to having big old churches, right? So they thought, well, we're on our way to bigger. So they built a big old sanctuary. They built a sanctuary that could seat about 2,500. And they thought they were going to end up having like at least, 3 or 4 services in these 2,500 seat sanctuary. Well, then this church got a conviction that they wanted to have women fully involved in ministry. Bible church, inclusive of women. They lost 1,000 people. This is in 2008. So they're recovering over a long period of time, 10 years they've recovered. But they're smaller, but they have this conviction. They're going to live this into this thing. They get to the pandemic and everything shuts down. And during the pandemic, it's right at a time where they have said, we are going to be a church that actually believes that our job is to minister to our neighborhood. Our neighborhood is more multi-ethnic than ever. So we're going to be intentionally a multicultural church. They start making changes. They lose 1,000 more people. Now they have this decision to make. They're now about 2,500 members. And they are an amazing church that affirms women in ministry, that is more multi-ethnic. They've got the most racially diverse staff I've ever seen. They are, say, deeply committed to their core. I'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes in terms of their core values, but they made adaptations. Like, we're a Bible church. We read the Bible. We think the Bible tells us that women should be in ministry and we should be multicultural. We should look more like Revelation. I mean, they lived out those values. Again, they're a church I probably couldn't be a member of, but I just appreciated how they did it. And all of a sudden they realize everything that they said that they're called to do is happening. The only problem is the pastor preaches every day to 500 empty seats. They built this sanctuary that they're never going to fill again. Now, for us, I go to a church that has about 200 people. so to be in a church that has 2,500, I'm thinking, what are you worried about? But what's it feel like to be preaching to 500 empty seats? And what's it feel like to have congregants who remember when you had 500 more people every service? And this is the competing values. So the sense of loss, we absolutely believe that we're supposed to go forward. We wouldn't be here if we didn't think we were supposed to go forward with this vision for being a multi-ethnic, multicultural church that cares for our neighborhood. And at the same time, we missed that we were once a mega church that had this place filled. And you start realizing it doesn't matter what size or what scale, the hard part is the leaders have to manage the loss. And they got to stay committed to the mission in the middle of the loss. What the adaptive change isn't, hey, we can take out all the we could take out all the chairs. We could tear down the building. We could build a new building. I mean, they got plenty of money. The answer is, how do you deal with the loss of people who are unconsciously saying, if we just did a little less on multicultural, and if we were a little more traditional, we might get 500 people back. Instead of holding to your values, moving forward. It's the process they have all the time. So principle number one is ultimately people don't resist change, they resist loss. And the second part I want to talk about is how you move people forward in loss. We'll talk about this the second section. And then we'll probably do, just because I lost some time because of my power, is we'll probably just come back and have a conversation here. And if we want to, we can put back into small groups again, if that's helpful. But let me just kind of move us forward just a little bit into the next section. So let me talk about the next piece. I want to start with a story that I think is helpful. So I worked at Fuller Seminary for the last 18 months. I've run the Church Leadership Institute. For 6.5 years before that, I was a senior vice president. I went there to help our new president at the time. We're now preparing for a presidential transition. Our new president at the time, to basically think about reshaping theological education for this changing world. So after I'd done one big project around formation, I was doing another one that was basically trying to take on this challenge. Less and less people are going to seminary. Enrollments are down in every seminary, partly because churches are down in every places, but also because more churches don't require seminary education. So the question we started doing polls is, what do people want out of a seminary? And what we started basically getting back was, everybody thinks a seminary is a good idea to have. It's just not a growth industry. And that while people like our research and they want our resources, they don't necessarily need our degrees and they don't want to take on any more debt. So what should we do? Basically, that was a challenge I was given. I was given that as the senior VP. So I put together a team and we started working on it. And we had a proposal we took to the board of trustees about how we wanted to address this question. We started asking, how might we make our research and our resources available to people in the church who don't necessarily need our degrees or don't want to take on debt. That's how we framed it. Well, one of the trustees heard me give this presentation and he said, what you're talking about doing is doing a new innovative experiment in a really traditional institution. That doesn't go well, right? Like the more traditional the institution, the more resistance they are to innovation. And there's very little that is more resistant than seminary education. I mean, it's an 1,100-year-old business model that came out of a monastery. So seminaries are really, really resistant. So he said, you might want some help on this. And so he invited me, because he works in Silicon Valley, where all the tech companies work. He invited me to fly to Northern California, to Silicon Valley, to meet with a group of folks in a boardroom who would give me input on my project. So they were all folks who loved the church. They were church leaders. They were Christians. They were people who thought theological education was really important. And they worked for things like, they were like venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and tech people. And they said, here's what we want you to do, Todd. Give us a pitch. You get 12 minutes to tell us why this idea would be worth funding. Just like we're going to invest in it, just like a new company. Like, why would this be worth investing in? We're not giving you any money, but we do want to hear like your pitch. Just tell us, what do you want to solve? What's the problem you want to work on and why you think this is a good idea? And then we'll give you feedback. So I did. I spent like 12 minutes giving them a pitch, just that I just kind of described to you. And when I was finished, I looked around the room and they're all smirking at me. I mean, I could just tell that they're all kind of looking at me like, oh gosh, well, that was cute. But finally I went, what? And one of the guys says, you've been doing that talk around the seminary a lot, haven't you? And I said, yeah, like that's how I got here. I gave it to the board of trustees and one of the trustees heard me and I've had to tell faculty because you can't do anything unless the faculty agree and get on board. And I got to raise a bunch of money. So I've had to get the development team to get excited about raising money for it. And I got to hire staff. He says, yeah, he goes, because this is what you did. You just gave us a pitch that basically said, we need to do this or the seminary won't survive. Todd, nobody cares whether your institution survives. They only care if your institution cares about them. So go talk to them. Talk to the people you want to and find out what they care about and figure out how your seminary could help them. And I started realizing this is something that happens in every institution, every organization. The default behavior for most organizational leaders is to solve the problems for our organizations rather than change our organizations for meeting the needs of the world. So when I talk to church leaders all the time, I'll go, tell me what your problem is. Almost every time, like, tell me the problem that you want to solve. Tell me the thing that's keeping you up at night. Tell me the thing that you're most worried about. Almost every time, it is something internal. Our older people are mad. Our donors aren't there. People aren't coming back. We start realizing that we want to solve these internal problems. The problem with that is you can solve your internal problems and you still might not have any relevance to the world. I was consulting with a seminary president from another seminary. And I said to him, I said, tell me, what is your biggest problem? He said, it is to survive. Like, we're going to go down. And I went, and it's one of those moments where every consultant knows you're about to ask a question that could get you fired. I had to look at them and say, survive for what? What is our reason for being? And ultimately, that's the work that we're always doing in adaptive change. We're asking, how might we be the healthiest version that we are as a congregation? How might we be transformed so that we can meet the needs of our neighbor, of our community, like fulfill the mission that God has us in the world? How might we be transformed for this neighborhood, for this reason for being? And what happens, you see this all the time, that happens in when I'm working with churches in transition, is what they do at this moment is they begin to aspire. Well, what we really need to do is be like this. And it's a little bit like me saying, well, what I really need to do is slam dunk a basketball. Now, you can't see me by standing up, but I'm 6 feet and squatty. The idea that I'm ever going to slam dunk a basketball is kind of crazy. But what we do is we give ourselves aspirations that we try to live into rather than adaptations of who we actually are. So adaptive change is not about becoming what you're not. It's not, like I would say, Presbyterians who think, well, if we just took the word Presbyterian out of our name, we called ourselves the Flood, we got rid of the organ, I got a smoke machine, if we just had a kicking band, well, then it would all work. Adaptive change is not about becoming what you're not. It's about being the healthiest version of who you are in order to in order to fulfill the mission that God has for you. So, the first principle we talked about is people don't resist change, they resist loss. The second I mentioned briefly, and we can come back to, is the future is here, it's just on the margins. It means that as we start paying attention to the folks who we've been missing, we start bringing in voices of folks that we haven't heard from, we will begin to change. As soon as we understand that we're in uncharted territory, and we start realizing that there are other people who are not trained the way we were, who are not shaped the way we were, who are not formed for this institutional church, and their voices come in and start changing us, we start feeling the need to change. It's when you get young people involved in ministry, and all of a sudden you start realizing, oh my gosh, we're not a kind of church that attracts young people. It's like just and any of our kids, any of our grandkids. I worked with a really great Presbyterian church in Austin, Texas, and they're in Austin, Texas. They got the fastest growing young adult population in the country. And when I asked them challenges in front of them, they said almost nothing about young adults. And the reason clearly was there was only one young adult in the room, and one voice usually will be zero voices. One voice will be silent. You need to have at least two voices of a group of people who have been marginalized to feel able to be amplified enough for people to hear it. So as we start making changes, part of what then begins to happen is we realize we've got to make those changes in a way that is healthy. And this is the part that I always like to land on, because this is something you can do right now. You can go home, you can go back to your churches, you can start this, you can do this over the summer, you can do this right now. The weird part about adaptive change is it doesn't start by trying to have a big vision for what we're to do. It starts by having a clear understanding of who we are. For change to last, it must be a healthy adaptation of your core DNA. And your core DNA of an organization are your values. What happened to Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, this story is fraught with all kinds of both sociological and historical dilemma. But what happened when they hit the Lemhi Pass is they didn't go back. And if you ask them why they didn't go back, it's an interesting thing, because Their job was to find a water route that people were looking for 300 years, a water route that the entire economics of the United States of America depended on. They found out that that model was wrong, that there was no water route. So you can ask the question, why didn't they go back and tell Thomas Jefferson? Like, why didn't they just turn around and say, somebody's got to go tell the president there isn't a water route? We bought this Louisiana Purchase for a stupid reason. We thought we were going to get a water route. We didn't. We need another plan. But they didn't. Because what they did at that moment is they actually defaulted to their deepest value. Meriwether Lewis was tutored by Thomas Jefferson. His deepest values were Enlightenment values. Now, they're not necessarily mine or Christian values, but they were Enlightenment value. And the Enlightenment value was the growth of human knowledge will lead to the growth of human happiness. So the value is learn at all costs. So what he did when he sat on top of the Lemhi Pass is he said, we proceeded on. Because what he knew is that with every step, they would discover something new. And even though they wouldn't find a water route, they could find a whole new world that would open up the possibility for more happiness for the world. That was their deepest value. Now, we can argue about their value, and we can argue about whether it was true or right or good, or all the people they didn't make their life happy. There's all kinds of stuff. But it was their value. What this does, what the pandemic does, and the moment like this does, is it makes us ask ourselves, what's our deepest values? What do we most value? If we're going to have to learn, then we're going to learn for this reason. If we're going to face loss, if we're going to have to let stuff go, what are we not going to let go? Right? If we are going to navigate competing values, then what's the value that matters the most? For change to last, it must be a healthy adaptation of core DNA. The key to the future is actually in this way found in the past. And so for many of us, this becomes the moment where we can flip and we can actually bring engagement with people if we handle this well. Now, let me say something about this. Almost every time that I ask people, hey, tell me what your deepest values are, they tell me what their aspirational values are. They tell me what they think it should be. They tell me what they hope to be, wish to be, want to be. And they're missing that adaptation is built on your actual values. So for change to last, it must be a healthy adaptation of the DNA of the group, which means it has to be a healthy adaptation of what is true about you as a living organism. We believe in the body of Christ, and the body of Christ has a DNA, and those DNA are our actual values. So let me tell you a little bit about this. See how I think about this. This is a picture of my grandparents. My grandparents' names are Guido and Mary Evangelisti. My grandfather was an Italian immigrant who, during World War I, immigrated to the United States because they were conscripting young boys into the Italian military at the time. He was 16 years old. He made his way all the way to the coast from Italy to Belgium and then to Netherlands. He caught a boat from the Netherlands, ended up at Ellis Island. I've literally got right here on the wall, I got a copy of his signature from Ellis Island. He made his way from Ellis Island all the way to the redwoods of California, where he met my grandmother and they opened an Italian restaurant. When I was a little boy, I was babysat at their Italian restaurant. My grandmother used to yell out to me when I would be playing in the forest, because it was a little redwood forest. Todd, do you want the ravioli or do you want the crab? And I would say, can I have both? Because she was my grandmother. My grandfather had two really big values. Number one was families gather around food. You feed your family, you gather around food. So we would have these family suppers. Go to my grandmother's house. The day we showed up, we lived a long way away from them when I was growing up, but when I showed up at my grandmother's house, raviolis were on the table, right? Just boom. Family gathers around food. And the second was my grandfather deeply believed that if you got an education, you could do anything. He didn't have an 8th grade education, but he really believed so much in education that two of his daughters Even though he was mad at my grandmother when my grandmother got a driver's license because women shouldn't drive, 2 of his daughters got master's degrees because education was such a huge value. So now here's what you need to know about my grandfather. He died before I was born. He had a heart attack when he was 60, and I never knew him. That's how pervasive values are. They go all the way. They're bigger than a personality. They go all the way through. And the same values are still held by my family. We have family suppers, and my kids do family suppers. My kids do family suppers with their friends. I will call them on a Sunday afternoon before the pandemic. And now that's beginning to happen again. And I'll say, hey, do you guys want to talk to them? And say, no, we're having family supper with our friends. They're like, this is what our family does. We gather people we love around food. And we believe deeply in education. We just do. We have lots of earned degrees between all of us. Now, because my grandfather died when he was 60, and because I'm 58, and my kids are not in any hurry to give me grandkids, I know I can't eat the way that old Italian ate. So what he called Tuesday night dinner, I call Christmas. I have that meal once a year. And our family dinners have as much salmon as they have raviolis. We eat healthier. Why? Because I want to see grandkids someday. And that notion of healthy adaptation of your core DNA is what's at the heart of this. The world has changed. My values haven't. My values have to adapt. So I still believe deeply in education, and I still believe deeply that family gathers around food. I just got to cook different recipes. Now, one of the reason I tell you the story is when you're trying to figure out your church DNA, you do the same thing. You do it not by sitting down and saying, what are our values? You get people together and you have them tell stories. One of the most powerful things you can do for change in the congregation is have them tell stories. Tell stories about a hero, like I just told you about my grandfather. Tell a story about a cherished moment that's retold over and over again, about the way in which I showed up at my grandmother's house every time and I could smell raviolis on the table. Tell a story about the church that are the same way. Like if I asked you to tell you about the story of the church that I pastored, I would tell you about Ruth, who used to walk up to me every single Sunday after I finished preaching and say, I prayed for you again today, boy. I pray for you every day, boy, every day. She called me boy. Other people had to call me Reverend Dr. Boy. She got away with calling me boy because she was in her 80s and she was deeply godly, amazingly kind woman. And I remember her praying for me mattered so much to me that one time when I was in a particularly low point, I said to her, Ruth, I really need you to pray for me. We're doing this big building project and everybody's cranky about it. And so would you please just pray that I'll be okay? And she said, oh, I don't pray for that at all. She said, what I pray for is in the middle of all this big building project, you don't forget that your job is to faithfully preach us the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation. Yes, ma'am. You tell a story about a hero, you get a value. Tell a story about the fire, about the time the Camp Pendleton Marine Base caught on fire and our whole congregation just showed up and we called the base and said, anybody who needs a place to stay, send them with their kids, send them with their dogs. And our church lined up with minivans and people opened the minivan and said, we'll take 4 people and 2 dogs and put them in, send them home. We didn't know where they went. We just knew they went home with somebody. And 2 days later, when the base was finally safe, we brought them all back. And these people were just family. They hugged each other. They talked about having showers and meals and naps and checking their internet, kids getting to school. And we said, this is when we were at our best. This is the moment we're most proud of us. Tell those stories. Those stories are your actual values. I used to show this picture all the time whenever I would teach this. This is actually a picture from our church. It was a picture that was found in the city hall for years. The caption says, if you can't see it, First Sunday School held on beach in San Clemente. We were a beach town. And what was interesting is that in the longest time in San Clemente, this was in the city hall, but they covered up the caption with another caption that said early marine biology class because it is California and you didn't want to have something that looked like a church picture in a city hall. But when they took it down and they figured out it was a church picture, they had sent it to us and we blew it up. And during our building campaign, this is the picture we had up. Other building campaigns usually do a model of how cool the building's going to look. We had this picture because what we wanted people to know was this is why we're doing the building campaign. This is the value of our church. And the first thing people notice is there ain't no building in the picture. And we're like, right, we're not building buildings for building's sake. We're building buildings so we can replicate this. Notice it's a multi-generational group of people. That's what we cared about. Noticed that there were both children and adults together. That's what we cared about. Notice that there's this big, thick Bible in the center, just like Ruth would want. And notice also, by the way, that a woman's teaching. And I always point this out. And I said, because we're Presbyterians, we believed in women in ministry for 40 years. By the time I got there, they'd never had a woman pastor. We put this picture up. They've had 4 since then. What has it done? This is who we are. This is really who we are. That's where your values come from. So when you reflect, you tell people, so I always say to people, you can do this week, you get people together. We did this on Zoom. Every church that we consult with, every church that's in we have these cohorts where churches come and join with other churches. And over an 18-month period, they learn how to lead adaptive change. We just take them through this process step by step. The first process is we teach them how to hold a storytelling exercise. And what the storytelling exercise does is it gets to your actual values. These stories lead to these stories lead to these values, and these values are who we are. And that's important because it helps us get out what's unique about us and what will never change about us. For change to last, it must be a healthy adaptation of the core DNA of the group. And once you've determined what will never change, you must then be prepared to change everything else. So if you think about this in terms of adaptive change, how do you not waste a crisis? Well, the first thing you do is you get really clear that the crisis is going to reveal underlying issues that we're going to have to adapt to. And that those things are going to be those deeper issues that we've been not addressing have actually in many ways been the deeper issues that most need addressing. This has been the big mistake that we make in almost every denomination. I mean, we're all sitting here in the PCUSA. How many times do we have friends and stuff who believe that the big problem in the PCUSA was the initials on the name? We're a denomination that's had 3 splits in a generation. And now what we have is 3 dying denominations. Like we thought that the technical fix of rearranging our polity or our names is going to change us. When truthfully, what we needed to do is be able to figure out how we hold on to what will never change and then be prepared to change everything else. People don't resist change, they resist loss. The future is here, it's just on the margins. For change to last, it must be a healthy adaptation of your core DNA, which means that what it really requires, first and foremost, is getting really clear on the values, who we are, what's important to us, and then being willing to let everything else go. And that's what's so painful. The loss is painful, partly because we haven't helped people understand what is so precious that we're going to hold on to it. Now, this doesn't solve the problem. It just gives you the path through the problem in a way that will help. So let me pause here before I go any further, because this is usually the place where we can begin to start thinking about, okay, how do we start putting this together? And let me be able to figure out how to answer. Let me answer any questions that this was raised, and then we'll just kind of debrief this a bit, and then I'll come back with some thoughts here to wrap us up before we're done. So, any questions this raises for you? Any thoughts about that?
So I find that churches very much struggle trying to define themselves because of that aspirational value, and also because they don't want to lose anybody. Their definition of themselves is usually inclusive to everybody everywhere, even if that's not the truth when you look inside of the church itself. So my question is, like, how do you help people see what the true values are? I know the stories, but like in the church that I'm in, it's 135 years old, and so where do you pick your stories from, and how do you help people find that? And then the other part of it, which this ties back to the last moment, you're asking, like, what are some of the things that we went around, and it's amazing that, like, one person can keep you from going forward or making a change, or it's like that one little burr from that screw you're trying to put in that won't let it go in, and so, and understanding that there might be loss connected to that and being okay with that.
Yeah. So what we'll talk about tomorrow with the larger group is this notion of resistance. It's really central. It's the one you'll notice that the one bullet point that I have faded out is you can't go alone, but you haven't succeeded until you survive the sabotage. So we'll talk about that one tomorrow. But what I want you to hold on to is this part that we live with this understanding that we actually hope that if we could just say things broad enough and kind enough, then everybody will go. And the reality is we actually have to almost go the opposite direction. So let me show you, I'm gonna share my screen one more time and show you a couple of slides that I use a lot. So one of the things we do is we offer cohorts for churches who want to take a small group of people to teach them adaptive change. Like, so you can sign up for cohorts. Some of them are hybrid, they're around the country, others of them are fully online. And what we've done is we've taken this consulting process that we've done with larger churches and we've made it for churches who want to just learn together in cohorts. And so we have these whole cohorts. This is the two questions that we use all the time. It starts with this: how might the charism of our church address the pain point of our community as an expression of God's mission in the world? Notice, to do adaptive change, you start with, what's the charism of our church? We use that phrase a lot. Charism is that Catholic phrase that I love so much. It's what makes the difference within the larger umbrella. So the difference between, say, a Benedictine and a Jesuit. So we can say, look, we're all Presbyterians, or we're all Christians, or we're all, well, what makes our church unique? What's the unique gift? So, Benedictines, their unique gift is the intersection of prayer and work. Like, they teach, you show up at a Benedictine monastery, you don't have to tell them you're a Catholic. You don't have to tell them you're a Christian. They just invite you to pray. This is what we do. We're going to have prayer. You're welcome to prayer. And if you stay more than 2 days, we're going to ask you to do dishes. Why? Because we think prayer also is part of your everyday life. This is our charism. You go to hang out with Jesuits, there's no monastery to hang out with. Why? Because they weren't about monasteries. They were about being missionaries. So if you want to go hang out with Jesuits, you go to Georgetown, not to a monastery. Why? Because their charism was different. How does the charism address the pain point of our community? What's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the thing that God's put on our heart? What's the thing that we can be part of? And how does he do this as an expression of God's mission in the world? And the answer can't be welcome everybody. It's got to be, what's the unique thing we offer? And then how might that inspire us to faithfully change and grow? So the diagram we use to describe adaptive change is this. It starts with charism, getting really, really clear. This is who we are as a church. This is what our gift is. This is the thing we offer to this community. And here's the pain around us. Here's the pain point, the way the world is changing, the thing that gives us a particular burden that we're going to address. And as we move from our charism into that pain point, it will require us to change. And because it requires us to change, it's going to require that transformation is where we're going to find our adaptive work. And it's going to be part of that is going to then lead to resistance and sabotage. So partly to answer your question, what we're doing all the time is we're acknowledging that there will be sabotage. Like, there's going to be resistance. And you're right. One person can be the squeaky wheel. One person, one small group of people can just stop the whole process unless we're really clear that this is the process that we are called to go through. We invite them into it, to this transformation, and we acknowledge that there may be loss. And until we're comfortable leading through loss and even experiencing loss, we're going to get stuck. And the smaller we get as congregations, the more we feel those losses, which is why starting the best time to start a change process is yesterday, and then moving from there.
Sorry, just had a little light bulb moment from when you were speaking. So like saying the opposite of this, when a church is trying to reach a group because it's its aspirational group, but it doesn't match with its core, that church fails almost every time.
Almost every time. So like, think about this. Almost every church I know. Well, here's one example from an evangelical Presbyterian church I know. They were in Phoenix, Arizona, actually Scottsdale, Arizona, a very particular part of Phoenix, Arizona, a wealthier church that the growing population was retirees. Like the fastest growing part of the population was retirees. And when I went to meet with them, they asked me to do some consulting. And when I went to meet with them, I actually pulled up some demographics and I said, hey, look, here's the other part. The fastest growing part of your population are retirees. And you happen to be one of the places in the country where your healthcare is so good, people are living longer. You're probably going to be one of those weird parts of the country that's going to have more people who live to over 100 than almost every place. So tell me again, you're a Presbyterian church that likes to really have traditional worship, and you've got like this lots of resources and lots of means, and you want to engage people in service. Tell me again the pain point that you want to solve. And they went, we want to reach young families. And I went, well, great. Young families are awesome, but why do you want to reach young families? And they go, because there's a church down the street in the junior high that all the young families go to. And I go, okay, great. But why is that your pain point? And they went, well, because we don't want to die. I said, how about this? How about you get really good at reaching baby boomer retirees who are going to live into their hundreds, and then let somebody 30 years from now take on this problem? And they went, oh, nah, we want to have young families. Well, okay. Right? Like, I said, no, I'm not against young families at all. Almost every church I want to work with wants to reach young families. It's great. But what we want to do is we want to reach young families the way we used to do it, instead of thinking through, what is it that we bring to the table? What is it that we uniquely bring? What is it that our gift is? What can we be part of? What's the impact we can make for the sake of God's mission in the world that will require us to be transformed? And that part of getting clear that adaptation is built on your actual values, that it's going to require you to learn as you go. And you're going to have to let go of what brought you here. You're going to have to drop those canoes and develop new capacities, is at the core of the leadership challenge that we have. Other questions or thoughts? We'll just stay on this for a few more minutes.
Todd, I have a question of, you have talked about managing the pain. Is there a way to acknowledge it or to honor it? Honor it sounds weird, but I mean, like when people die, we have memorial services. Is there a way that is a healthy way to actually acknowledge that loss and lift it up?
Yeah, well, for one thing, it's by the best ways to do it is to talk about competing values, right? So competing values are honest when you're honest about both things as having value, right? So here's a typical, we just talked about one, right? So we know we want to change, but we also want to reach people that we're struggling to reach, like say young families. There's a good example. So we have a competing value. Okay, how do we want to solve that value? We want to stay the same and we want to reach young families. What most churches do is they use a technical solution to try to face that adaptive challenge. The technical solution is we'll hire a younger pastor. So we try to hire the younger pastor, and you all know, like the young, mostly male pastor that has young kids is in high demand in many congregations. But even when that person gets hired, what happens then is the congregation says, we hired you, so we don't want to change anything else. You solve the problem. And so actually, every time that I have this, somebody says to me, somebody will say to me, hey, wait a second, I may be the technical solution to their adaptive challenge. Yes, they hired you so they wouldn't have to change. So the challenge, first of all, has to be, we've got a name that we're going to have to be changing, that we're going to, and that we are going to change through loss. We are right now, the book I'm working on is a book on how thinking about our discipleship has to have adaptive capacity built into it. We got to disciple people to understand that the way of Christ is the way of learning and loss and having to make hard decisions about values. What are you going to drop? What are you going to let go of? So when we talk about that, we've got to name that. The best way to name that is through empathy. Understand that people are experiencing loss. They're not being stubborn. They might be angry and they might be mad. They might even be trying to take your job, but they're doing so because they're grieving and they're fearful. So one of the things we coach people in our cohorts is, how do you get up on the balcony and see the system for what it is? So when you have like the choir that barely sings on key anymore, that makes it feel like, oh my gosh, somebody needs to tell them. And they keep wanting to sing at all the services and they can't figure out why no one wants to come to our worship service. And then their answer is, well, if you got some younger voices, we could keep singing. And you realize there are very few people who want to come sing in a bad choir. Who's going to tell them they're a bad choir? Well, part of what you recognize is when you ask them what it is, they realize what they're losing is, for most people who sing in a choir, this is the deepest community they have. They meet with them regularly. This is the people who have shared their faith and their aesthetic, and they have memories, and they did choir trips. And oh my gosh, remember when we got to sing in Paris? And they have this history, and you're actually asking them to leave and grieve something for the sake of something else. So I always say to pastors, empathy, attunement accelerates change. You get closer to people and you walk them through the loss process, but you are clear that we're moving. You stay calm, you stay connected, you stay the course. You're clear that you're moving. And we see this all, if you look closely, you'll see it all the way throughout the scriptures. Jesus all the time facing with people who are resisting the good news of the kingdom. He's walking alongside with them and pulling them forward with them. And that is so much of our work. Our adaptive leadership is built around the emotional intelligence of moving people through their loss so that they can move forward, which also means they can understand that their losses enable them, if they can grapple with their losses enable them by experimenting forward. They can discover things they haven't discovered yet. Like that there's whole new ways of being together, things they wouldn't have seen before. So you experiment your way forward is part of the way of doing that. Maybe take one or two more, and then I want to close with a story that I think is helpful.
Todd, how many experiments do you get before they say knock it off?
Yeah, good question. So here's what I always say. So if you think about experiments, I always think people often say, if only we knew the future, we could be fine, right? So we could just predict the future. Think of how many of us were told, like back in the 90s, the old Wayne Gretzky thing, skate to where the puck is going, not to where it's been. Well, in a world like today, I don't think you can predict anything. No one could have predicted this. I can tell you, COVID-19, if you'd have told me that in the summer of 2022, we'd still be dealing with it, no way, right? Don't predict, prototype. Make the prototypes, make your experiments the simplest, safest, modest experiments you possibly can. If you tell me you're going to experiment by trying a brand new Sunday morning service that disrupts the other two, I'm going to tell you that's not an experiment. If you tell me you're going to experiment by inviting people to consider coming one night a week to a contemplative service to see who likes it or not, then that's probably better. So when most of us get tired of experimenting, it's because they feel manipulated by leaders who are calling things experiments, where what they really mean is trial balloons. If I can get you all to think this is okay, we're going to change. Not. That's why focusing on what we learn. What are we learning about this? So I'll tell you one little story about that before I tell you the one I want to tell you. When I was pastoring in San Clemente, I think I was just about to turn 50. And my worship director was turning 30. And she said, hey, we're having a birthday party for me. I'm inviting all the staff. We'd love you and Beth to come. And I'm going, oh, good. I'm going to go to a party. I'm 20 years older than everybody. I'm not going to know anybody there. This is going to be great. But I love my worship director. She was amazing. I loved her family. I did her wedding. I said, okay, for you, I will come to your birthday party, but I'm not staying very long because the last thing in the world you want at your 30th birthday party is your 50-year-old pastor sitting there. Your friends are going to freak out, right? And I'm not going to know anybody. Well, I walk in the room, Beth and I walk in the room, and we know everybody. Like, we're stunned. I know them all. They were all people who had once gone to our church. And most of them had walked away from the church. So now we're awkward for a whole nother reason, which is I'm thinking, oh my gosh, these people are going to feel totally guilty that I'm here. And then I walk up to them and none of them are guilty at all. They're grabbing, they're hugging me. Pastor Todd, it's so fun to see you. It's like, I'm completely confused, right? I'm with a bunch of 30-year-olds who don't go to my church anymore, who think I'm pretty okay, and they're glad to see me. And I just don't even know what to make of this. So the next Monday, I said to Brianna, our worship director, I said, hey, I'm at your birthday party. I realized everybody there used to go to our church. She goes, I know. I felt a little awkward. I said, and they don't come to our church anymore. And she said, you're right. I said, and they don't come to our church and you're the worship leader. She goes, I know. I go, so do we know why they're not coming? And she goes, no, I can't figure it out either. I said, so would you do something? Would you ask any of them who'd want to, if they'd be willing just to have dinner with me? So I could buy them dinner and ask them why they don't come to our church. And I promise you, I will not guilt them. I will not make them feel bad. I just want to know. We ended up having 6 weeks of dinners with a group of folks where what we talked about was all the ways their life and their faith formation was changing, and that they needed the church to be a safer place for their exploration, and they needed, in one sense, to push off of us. Well, what I realized was the experiment we had, I kept thinking, oh, we have a young worship leader that will bring them. No. Oh, they just need to like the pastor, or maybe they don't like me. No, there was a whole other thing going on, which was about their own developmental process, that what they mostly needed us to be was a place they could push off from and come back whenever they needed us. It was a totally different thing. If they knew that we didn't guilt them when they left, they would have a better chance of maybe coming back to some other church later. It was only because we showed up and thought of it in terms of learning, not in terms of solving that problem. I always say you got to see the problem before you solve the problem. So here, let me just tell you this last story, because it's my favorite story out of the whole canoeing the mountains metaphor. They make it to the Pacific Ocean. You know, Sacagawea, who is the teenage Native American woman, brings them to the Shoshone. The Shoshone are so excited to meet them because they brought them back this girl who they thought had died. They realized she had been kidnapped when she was 11 or 12, and she'd been sold as a slave, and the Corps of Discovery literally took her home. They were so excited, so grateful that these white folk had done this, that they actually gave them a guide to get them through the mountains. They would never have made it without the Shoshone helping them. They make it to the Pacific Ocean, and when they get there, they realize they're never going to make it back before the winters almost kill them anywhere. They're going to have to spend the entire winter on the coast of Oregon with it raining on them for months until they can turn around and go back. So they make a fort, and that's where they're going to spend the winter. And the fort is in uncharted territory, it's an unclaimed territory. So wherever they put the flag in that fort is going to now be the United States of America. They're a military unit that has all the authority of the government to establish the flag. We're going to establish America. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were military people. They had the authority to establish America. And what they decided to do is establish America with a really American idea. They took a vote, and they gave everybody in the Corps of Discovery one vote, including Sacagawea, and including York, William Clark's African-American enslaved man. The first time a woman, a Native American, or an African-American had a vote in anything resembling a United States election was 100 years before the rest of the world caught up. The part I want us to think about as church leaders is that right now the church is the most resistant place because of the changes of the future. What if we were to believe that the God of the future is pushing us into uncharted territory so we could show the world what the future is supposed to look like? What would it be like for us to think that we're in uncharted territory because we know the God of the future, the God of Revelation 5, the God of every tribe and nation? We know the God who knows this. And if we were to see what would it be like for us to ask ourselves what it means to live into what our book of order calls the provisional demonstration of God's new humanity for the sake of the world, what would it be like for us to see ourselves as a community of people going into uncharted territory so what we learn, we could show the rest of the world? Could we dare to believe that it could be that different? That's why I believe God's taking us for change. It's not so that our churches will survive. It's because the rest of the world needs to see what the future looks like from a group of people who believe in that and could live differently. And so that's why I commend you to your work. Let me stop with that.
Thank you, Todd. I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel like there's a whole lot to chew on for a little, until tomorrow when we have our Presbytery meeting and get another dose to chew on as well. I neglected to open us with prayer, but I would love for us to be closed in prayer. And I wonder, Dan, would you be so kind as to close us in prayer?
Sure. Let's pray. Our God of grace, we thank you for the time that we've been able to spend together this afternoon, for more things to think about and consider as we continue to lead congregations in these challenging times. We pray that you would enable us to be resilient people who move forward from a position of knowledge and confidence and share the good news that we have experienced with those that we meet. We pray that you would be with us as we continue in the run up to tomorrow's meeting, that all that we do, whether it be worship, learning, or the business that we need to conduct, would meet with your approval. These things we ask through Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for being with us. We look forward to seeing most of you tomorrow, I suppose.
Thank God. It was great. It was wonderful. Thank you.